Hey there. So, Noah's Ark. You know, that's a story that doesn't really have any. It's an ancient story, is what I should say. That story is like one of the oldest written stories that was ever written. It was a story that was transcribed from like the oral tradition. It was an old Sumerian. It was one of the first actual Sumerian stories ever written by the Sumerians, and the Sumerians had the first written language. It goes back that far, and so it had been around for quite a while, and it's a story of how God basically just gets wrathful and angry and destroys everybody on the earth but a couple of people. Well, basically kind of like a rather large extended family, perhaps. But the way that the way that it's kind of come to me now, it seems as though it was like quasi-nuclear family, like maybe 8 people or something. 4 people even. And so science shows ultimately that the human genome cannot remain viable with anything less than about 2,000 people. So there's no way that they could have repopulated the earth, this small, really small group of people. Yet, you bring that fact forward, and what those that believe in Noah's Ark as being like the Word of God, they will say, well, God probably just willed them, to be able to reproduce. And so the logic then is, well, if he willed them to reproduce, then why didn't he just will the rest of the world to do what he demanded? To be such that wouldn't aggravate him so much, that wouldn't cause him all this wrath. You see? And yet, you see the illogic of the whole story? God allows that really infuriates him to then become to the point to where he then flushes the world in a fit of rage. You see? And the same thing for the Sodom and Gomarah bit. It's another Old Testament story. The book of Moses, after all. The Torah. And it says that God got pissed off and wasted 2 cities because they were all, well, the way that the modern people say it, the way that, they call themselves evangelists, but what they are is they call themselves Christian, but what they really are is just evangelists of hate. And what they're going around saying is that Sodom and Gomorrah was a bunch of homosexual people that God eradicated because God hated homosexuality. And yet, what? He's so ineffective as a God that he allows something that really causes him to become that wrathful to exist. You see how illogical that then is? Because if you know anything about the divine state of consciousness, such as that a God would have, you would know, you really would know, that such a being would never be wrathful. He couldn't possibly be angry. Because when all in the universe is yours, what is there to be angry about? So the idea that God hates humanity and he's going to destroy the world in a fit of rage, like the Noah's Ark and Sodom and Gomorrah and all them say, that just is not true. Say, even the Quran is really heavy on a wrathful God. That's why they do these things, like behead people, roast them alive on a spit, kill babies and stuff, as long as they're like the infidels. It's because they believe God to be in a state of wrath, to be entirely contemptuous of humanity. And that's what flows through the entirety of the 3 religions of Abraham. God in a state of wrath, because it's based on an ancient Sumerian story that was transcribed from an oral tradition. It was one of the first stories ever written. Somehow or another, Abraham latched onto that story in his lie or whatever, and called that the God of the monotheistic God. That representation of a wrathful God that destroyed the world, destroys cities. And yet that is not a divine state of consciousness. As any Dalai Lama will tell you, God cannot possibly be wrathful. Because how could then one be a God? If one was. See? To really be divine, you would never be wrathful. You wouldn't have an ounce of anger. Anger only comes from the human state of consciousness being unable to truly access our equal portion of divine free will. Because we are held in restraint to endure a process. And so, we experience the animal mind of rage. But that is not the divine state of consciousness that we will eventually ascend to. So God is not wrathful. The world is not going to end. Revelations is a lie. In order to make you afraid, because in that fear you will then do as religion says. And in that, they then can achieve a state of governance over you that you willingly then give, because you are afraid, because you don't know the truth, because we are at a time of pagan ignorance, because you're all thinking this from that in your basic thought logic. So there is change coming, and that is going to be the crucial thing over the next several years, next possibly as long as 300. But the change, there's already two factors set up to really move this change forward. See, we're at a point in time when we're moving out of the age of magic and mysticism and into the age of logic and reason. So that is going to require a lot of change in the basic structure of this society. And it's going to mean that this religion that is anchored in the age of magic and mysticism, that does not understand that this is a creation process, but rather defines it as a struggle between the forces of good and evil, that pagan religion is what is holding society back from moving forward, as is the conservative political message of keep America what it was, rather than accepting the reality of change upon us. There's two things coming on. There's two things already happening in the society that is going to cause stress, enough stress to totally change the world. And that is wealth consolidation and global warming. Because something has to happen severe enough to challenge everyone's beliefs. Because that is what has got to happen in order for the society to move forward. The religion has to change. And what's going to get it to change is some kind of personal stress, such as that global warming and wealth consolidation is going to do to the world. So yes, things are going to get really rough over the next few, who's to say, centuries, decades. But it's going to happen right quickly, within a few centuries at least. So yeah, there is a God, and this God will act in a manner of absolute precision to cause an environmental condition such severe enough to change the human frame of thought from this, from that, to this with that. In other words, this could very well be how your eyes and ears are open as you then ascend into a new age of true enlightenment. Because that's the kind of stress that is upon this world, this society, and us at these times. That is truly what is the process of creation. So, God is not wrathful. Sodom and Gomorrah was not because of a wrathful God. Who's to say if it was? I mean, it might have been the real cities. They might have been destroyed by some natural event, but it wasn't because of the will of God. Unless, it's just the creation process. I mean, that's why bad things happen. It's not because humanity has failed God, because religion is ignorant enough to prescribe God in a state of perfection and therefore create a dogma that cannot change and as such cannot accept discovery. Well, that dogma is going to change and it is going to accept discovery. And God will never be considered to be the perfect thing. The heavens are not perfect because God doesn't care about perfection, because that is not what the objective of this third dimensional environment is. The objective of this environment is creation of a society of divine equals that God may then live among as someone other than God. That is what our objective is. That's what we are for Him. This is not some war. God is not so weak that there is an antithesis to His will here. And He's not all about the niceties, comfort. He creates adversity in the world to make you a complete human being. There is suffering in the world because that is what is necessary to create the internalized emotions within your soul that craft you unique by them, that give you your true state of individuality. As only you are having this emotional experience in the manner in which you are, in the time which you are, in the compartment that you are in. And that's how you are then made unique. And that's what this is all about. Creation of unique individuality. And therefore diversity is what is divine. Acceptance, tolerance, humanity. Those will what will bring the best joy and love. There is more craft of individuality and joy than there is in suffering. But eventually humankind will prevail. We will arrive at a point of equality with God. The world is not going to end. God is not wrathful. And all this stuff about how God can't stand homosexuals, all this stuff about how God can't stand the Muslims, or there's all this preaching, all these religions talk about God being an intolerant state. Look, He don't care what you believe. If He did, He'd be here in governance over you. And then again, He does care what you believe, because He's put me here to tell you the truth, that this is a creation process. And therefore you don't need to be afraid, especially of Him, because He's not going to uncreate you. He's a divine being after all. Alright, so with that, I'll see you next time.